All right. Just kind of crickets. Great. So welcome to the P1 lecture. So Glenn David, you're on Zoom. Can you hear it okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Working on that. Hey.
You might want to pull the mic a little closer to you to keep the background.
Okay.
Just set it there.
So for some reason this isn't recording. Bonnie, I think this might be Jared's Zoom thing.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to record with Jared's Zoom. So
Justin, your record light is on. It says you're recording.
Is that?
It did that yesterday for me too, but it didn't actually record. But I think it's okay. I mean, the other option I think is to shift to your own Zoom, which would be a little bit of hustle for 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's we'll not record it, and if there's anything that you have missed,
it says you're recording.
Yeah, for some reason we're just not sure that particular thing is going to work because it looks like cloud recording. So we'll put it this way: if the recording works, great, we'll post it. If it doesn't, we will be at your service to help. So we're going to do this in just a pretty open way and take as much or as little time as we need. Glenn David had I was talking a little bit with him about testing this morning and just writing Mocha and Chai tests. And so I was going to start by doing that. We're going to write a couple functions and then write some tests for them. Is there anything else that we could look at this morning that would be useful? And let's see. I don't know if I can hear what's going on Zoom. Glenn David, would you try saying something?
What?
Just saying something on Zoom so I can see if I'll actually be able to hear people.
Oh.
Okay, I'm off mute. Hello, world.
Got it. Great. Perfect. And before I begin, forgive me, I need some water. So.
Not sure I can forget that.
I know. All right. So Mocha and Chai, how familiar are we with Mocha and Chai? Jedi, have you worked with them a little bit? Yeah, so Mocha and Chai are paired together what we use for testing. Mocha is this testing framework, test runner, and Chai is an assertion library. And it turns out that when you're doing testing, it can be useful to have both of those, a specific framework for both of those. So that's why we use those two. And there are lots of testing frameworks. So there's lots of other options. But for getting started, Mocha and Chai do the trick, and they do it pretty well. So what I want to do is we'll just write a couple functions first that just do something, and then we'll write some tests to make sure that they're doing that. Does that sound okay? Okay. So close this. All right. Can we see this okay? Is it big enough? Okay. So first function, let's just write a function that takes a string and returns the last 3 characters, just something basic. So we can do this as const last 3 characters is a function that takes a string and does something with it. So how would we do this? What's the easiest, simplest way to write a function to return the last 3 characters? String slice? Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm not remembering off the top of my head what the API is for that, so. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, so string slice. So begin index and end index, and the begin index, if it's negative, it's treated as string length plus begin index, where string length is the length of the string. So the last 3 characters should be this, -3. All right. So let's give it a shot. So we're going to return the string sliced -3. And it's just a tick. I use these semicolons still, so you'll have to forgive me on that too. I know, it's really kind of a retro thing.
How very hipster of you.
So a lot of times when we're kind of workshopping code, an easy thing to do is to write a function like this, and then to write some very informal tests right away to make sure that it's doing something. So you might do last 3 chars of A, C, D, E, F, G, and maybe last 3 chars of an empty string. And we'll console log that. And again, this is a very informal way that you might workshop some code before you've even gone in and written some tests. And just to be clear, we can do first, we can do G yields, and then we can do empty string yields so that we know what we're looking at. Cool. So now go to the terminal. Is that big enough? Is that better? Testing Mocha functions. So we're going to run node functions. And so we get EFG, an empty string gives us nothing. So great, we have written this little bit of code. We've ensured that it is working basically as we think. And one more thing that we might want to think about before we write a test for this is what we want to do in edge cases. So when there's no string passed, or when there's an empty string passed, when we get something that's other than a string. So what do you guys think? What should we do if an empty string is passed? throw an error. Invalid input. Okay. Okay. So do that if it's including if it's a string of 0 length. Okay.
If there's nothing in if there's nothing that can be coerced into something that has a length more than 0.
Okay.
If you have like a large number, you can return that to top string, so that should.
Okay. Yeah. So there are two things that you're talking about here that are particularly interesting. So coercing the value into a string is something that we could do, and then also this case of what you do with a blank string or an empty string. And the one thing I'll say about this, there's no right or wrong answer on this, and there very rarely is. For this particular situation, I might tend to do what this code is actually already doing when given an empty string, which is to just return an empty string. And the way that I think about that is an empty string is still a string, so it's still an input that could be a valid input. And if we were to take the last 3 characters of an empty string, it's kind of logical that that would just be nothing because there aren't the last 3 characters. And similarly, if we were going to take the last 3 characters of a string that's only 2 characters long, we'd probably just want to return those 2 characters. So I'm tempted to go that direction for the continuity of it, so that people know that they can pass in any kind of string of any length. But the coercion is an interesting thing. So what we can do is we could say, let's say let new string equal, and then Bonnie, do you know what this is to coerce something into a string?
Usually you can use .toString.
Okay.
Like the .toString method.
Yeah, and so using that will work on anything that can be converted to a string, and it will fail on anything that can't. And so that's one way to handle it. Great. So want to write some tests? Shall we write some tests? Bonnie, what is the Mocha test folder? Did we ever figure out, is it test or tests?
Oh, I believe it's with the plural, but hold on. Well, you can look it up as well as I can, but no,
Okay.
I don't remember whether it's singular or plural.
Unintuitive.
Oh, okay.
So while Bonnie's looking that up, I'm going to go ahead and install the libraries that we need. And I'm going to do this in testing Mocha Chai. So npm init, and this flag y just means yes to all of the questions that it asks. So instead of saying, do you want to name it this, and do you want the author to be this, and do you want the whatever, it'll just make your package.json for you. And then we want to install Mocha and Chai. So npm I Mocha Chai.
Yeah, I tried to find it under test.
Thank you. And tell me your name.
Patrick.
Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. So good. So let's see. So going in here, we've got our package.json. These are actually regular dependencies, and what we want to do is make these dev dependencies. So you could do that by, I'll actually do it from the command line. So npm, what is it? Delete or remove?
Uninstall, is it?
Is that what it is? And so what we want to do is npm install save dev Chai Mocha. And that has some implications for down the road when you're working in dev and build environments. It just knows that for the build environment, you're not actually going to be doing testing at that point, so it doesn't need to include these other packages. It's a way to keep down the package bloat. So we've got Mocha and Chai. We know that it's in the test directory, so let's put file in there called tests.js. So
if we have at some point, because I have saved Mocha and Chai as just general dependencies, it was like, no, I don't want to actually do that. I just added the dev dependency line and just move it there. Is that okay too? Or is it more specifically uninstall it and reinstall it?
I think doing it that way is fine actually, because if you were to do it that way and then do an npm install, I'm not sure that anything would happen because it would say, well, these packages are already in node modules. So yeah, I think it's fine to do it that way, and I just did it this way because it's another way to do it. Great. So when we do test with Mocha, the Mocha is already in the scope when we go to run the tests, but Chai is not. So we can do const expect equals require chai dot expect. And then we want to import our functions. So const, and what did we call this? Last three chars. Last three, remembers that for me, equals require functions. Functions. Okay. So now Mocha tests always start with a describe. And this is where you, how would you put this, Bonnie? The text that you're putting here describes the feature, like the major feature you're testing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either the feature or sometimes the function that
Yeah.
you're testing.
Yeah. So here I might just put last three chars. And the second argument to describe is a function. And within that, we do it. And then this is where you would describe the functionality, what you are testing. So here we could do it returns the last three characters given a string greater than 3 characters. And here is another function. That's the second argument. And then this is where we run the test. And so this is where you can use multiple different assertion libraries, because what Mocha is looking for is when I run this function, that's the second argument, when I run this function, did it fail? Did it have an error or not? That's really what it's looking for. So Chai just turns out to be a nice and capable assertion library. And so that's why we would use that. But you can also do, Bonnie, is it just asserts or?
Yeah, you can just use assert.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is sort of the vanilla, like, is this thing true or not?
Yep. So we'll go ahead and use Chai. And so what we want to do is expect, and then the function, so last three chars, and we'll pass in A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So expect that to, is it 2 equal or 2b equal? I always have to look this up. 2 equal. And then this should be EFG. And you may find when you're writing tests like this that oftentimes the thing that you wrote as sort of a just informal test here translates pretty directly to what you end up writing in the more formal test. So I'm going to go comment that out. So that's one. And then we can do another one of these, another it. Bonnie and I were talking about this, that you could actually do another expect within the it, within this first it. But the advantage of creating another it, so running another it command here, is that it allows you to see if one test failed but the other one didn't. If you did like 3 or 4 expects in the same it function, you wouldn't know which one had failed. You would just know that that failed. So in this case, what we would say is it returns an empty string given an empty string. So expect last 3 characters of empty string to equal empty string. Good. So let's go ahead and see if these tests work. And the last thing I'm going to do is go out here and change test to be Mocha. Oh, not that one. The test script to be Mocha. Then we can go here and do npm test. And 2 failing. All right. Last 3 characters is not a function. Oh, we didn't export this from functions. So we're going to do export module. I'm having a brain fart. Modules?
Module.export.
Module.export.
Export.
That's right. There we go. So we'll do last 3 characters. All right. Great. So 2 passing tests. Huzzah. How is this? Is this informative, useful? Keep going and do another one. Cool. So yeah, let's write one more function. What should this one do?
What would you say? Something that's not like super intense air pulling out to test, but something that might be like an easy place to slip.
Let me turn that back on you for a second. What for you has been a tricky place with testing?
The hardest thing I think is when, for instance, like saving data or pulling data, making sure that what I've sent or serialized is exactly the same as what I'm going to open later. So I guess being able to compare a file that you created with what it's supposed to be without having to, I guess, create a giant skeleton file to match it is a lot of data. So we've had projects where we've had to like open a file and save a file. So just I'm going to make sure that the saved data matches the saved stuff in it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And Bonnie, I'd be curious what you think about this. You know, in a test like that where you're writing a file, one way I could imagine doing it is in the test, you would read the file before you do the function, and then read the file after you've performed the function and added the thing, for example, and test to make sure that the thing was added, but everything else stayed the same. The other would be to, for the purpose of the test, have it writing to a different file that's specific for the test that you're trying to do, so that you're not overwriting anything that you've been, working on with the actual code, but you have this opportunity to write to a file and then check, is there one object in it?
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out is, like, say for instance, I'm trying to save out a data structure like a JSON.
Mm-hmm.
Or even, I guess, because JSON is like, say for instance, it's a large piece of just plain text that's being saved out by a file. So it's like the first chapter of War and Peace or something.
Okay.
How do I know if there is a way, without iterating through every word and matching it against the original book, how would I know that I've just saved that first page via text? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What ideas do you have about that?
I mean, that's the only thing I could think would be to open it back and iterate and check against the original source. Is that correct?
Sure, that's it's one way that you could do it. When you're, if it really is true that you have one real long string that represents the first chapter of War and Peace, and you've just written that string to a file, you could just compare those strings directly and let JavaScript under the hood go line by line with the string and make sure that they're the same thing. So you wouldn't have to manually do that. Do you have any thoughts to add?
That's probably what I would do. I would, if it was just text, then I would probably just compare the two strings. If it was JSON, I would probably go a step further and make sure that it was valid JSON and that I could, turn it into an object and that I could get out the expected data from it. But yeah, I think the best you can do is, I totally agree with Justin, write to a test file, which is sort of the equivalent of writing to a test database if you were doing database tests. So have a different test file. Don't write to your actual production file, and then read it out and make sure what you're reading out is matches what the function was supposed to do when it wrote to the file.
Mm-hmm.
So I would, the other thing is I would definitely have just one function that takes stuff and writes to the file, right? I would make it as modular as possible. The other thought was I would also just make sure that I tested when the file was empty versus when the file already had something in it, right? And make sure that I conduct both of those tests because it could work in one of the situations and fail in a different one. So for one of them, my preparation for the test would be to just have a brand new empty file, and for the other one, my preparation for the test would be to have a file that already was.
Yeah, and so so let's actually write that function or a function like that, and then I'll show you a way that you can, one way to have it redirect to a different file when you're doing just tests. So what we can do here is do const output file, and right now, let's have that be just output.txt. So then function, and let's do it where we're writing a string to a file X times. So we're just repeating that string X number of times. So write to file X times. So we're going to take a string again, and we're going to take n for number of times. And now we need the node fs library. So node So there's fs read, let's see, we want write. Yeah, so write sync, and yeah, there we go. So it takes in the file, and this is a file name or file descriptor, and then takes in the data, which can be a string or a buffer or an int array. Huh, wonder what that is. And optional encoding. So, what is it? It's const fs equals require fs. So, great. What do we do here? Yeah, so let's first make the string. So a lot of times when I have a function like this and it's going to be producing a result, or we're producing a result bit by bit, I'll actually just call this result to keep it clear. So var result equals, and in Python there's a great way to do this, to repeat something 5 times. I'm not sure if it's doable in JavaScript. Do you know? Okay. What's that?
It'll give you not a number.
Not a number if you try to multiply it. Good. So how else could we do it? What's that? Uh-huh. Dumb for loop. Yep. So yeah, for let I equal 0, I is less than n. So actually, let's do it this way. I is 1, while I is less than or equal to n, I plus plus. And then here we do result plus equals the string, and that should do it, right? What's that? We didn't write to the file yet? Not yet, yep. So we could do a quick test of this by doing a console log and just console log what the result is, and then run this test with write to file, and we'll do this 3 times. So again, just to make sure that it's working the way that we think it is, node ABC, ABC, ABC. Perfect. So now let's write it out to a file. And we want to make a decision here if we're writing to the file and overwriting, or if we're writing to the file and appending. What do you think we should do?
I mean, I would actually first think about checking to see if one exists, because then if opening a new file would only be if we've already checked to see if something's written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we could check to see if the file is there in the first place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we could check for that. My guess is about the FS library that if you tried to directly go and append to a file, like write and append to a file that didn't exist, it would just create the the file, so that whether the file exists or not, the end result is you've written to the file and appended to anything that might otherwise be there. Let's look at the documentation and just see what the best way is to do that, to append, if we were going to do that. So node append to file. So let's see if it's in here. The easiest way to append is fs append file. Okay, great. Great, so same thing, different function name. So here we want to do fs append, what was it? Append file. And let's keep this, let's do the sync version for now, the synchronous version. So fs append file, we've got the file name already, output file, and we want to give it a string, so result. And I don't think we need to do any of these flags right now. Great, and this function won't return anything because the purpose of it is to have this side effect of writing to the file. You know, we could have it return the string result, but I don't see any need to do that. So let's go ahead and see if this works. Now this function should just write to the output file ABC, ABC, ABC. Calling an asynchronous function, oh, it's, so the error here is deprecation warning. Calling an asynchronous function without a callback is deprecated. What we want here is the synchronous version. So, and actually, let's see. So it did work, ABC, ABC, ABC. So let's just try it again now with this other function. And then check output.text. Great. So that's working. So now one thing that we can do to make it easier to test with this is we can use an environment variable. Have you worked with environment variables? Okay, so we can use environment variables to, in the moment, specify that we want to write to a different file. And the way we could do that is we set the output file to be process.env. And let's call it output file. So we want it to be whatever we pass in as an environment variable called output file, or if there's nothing, then we want to use output.text, right? And so the way to do this is from the command line, we do node, or we do output file equals, and let's call this test output.text. And then on that same line, node functions.js. So this has the effect of setting that environment variable for this one function call. And hopefully, if we look at this, we've got a test output file, cat test output, and it's ABC, ABC, ABC. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah. So does that just work for that one call? When you set that variable, like if you call that again, is it still going to be set to the test output, or is it going to try to put
Yeah, so it's just for that one function call. The putting it So the other way we could do it is we could set it as a environment variable in general, using set export. I always forget this one. Bash set.
I thought there was one without putting it within your like bash RC that you could have it just for that session until you close bash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are two ways you can so actually, you can think of it as three ways to set environment variables. You could set an environment variable for your entire computer's environment. You can set it just for this particular shell session, or you could set it just for that particular call, right? And so we did the way for the particular call. And
the variable declaration on the same line as the call.
Mm-hmm. And there can't be any spaces. So it's the environment variable name, equal sign, and then whatever it is all together. Yeah, so, actually, let me check. Yeah, so this, yeah, so that does do it just for this line. But if we were to do output file equals new test output.txt, then that would set it for this shell. So I'll go. And there are situations where you might want to do either. You might already have these environment variables set, or there are actually some libraries that are pretty helpful to do configuration like this that you'd get into more in P3. So that's, I would say this is a pretty common pattern for this is you have a default, but you are taking in some configuration piece for your code via environment variables. So then let's translate this into a test. So, so it's export varname equals whatever for if you want to set it for all processes started from the current shell. Oh yeah, okay, so that's all processes started from the current shell. If you want to set it system-wide, then it looks like you just edit this file directly. That seems a little bit clunky. But most of the time you'll be doing this one, or the way where you're running it right on the command. So let's do the test here. So want to walk me through this?
We're going to go ahead and describe
write to file X times. Yep. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, we use an arrow function here.
And it concatenates the given strings in time. So
okay.
So would before this describe, would we want to do we need to check the state of the file first, or do we not need to worry about the scope of this test?
Yeah, good question. What I would be inclined to do is to set the environment variable here.
May I make a suggestion? Often what's done is in the you set the environment
Got
So
it.
you do, yeah.
Like I said, set it in the test script. So yeah, so here we would do output file equals and then test output dot txt and then run Mocha. Do you need the semicolon? I think it was working for us when up here when we were doing it with Node.
The semicolon just means that Mocha is a different command than the export that you're doing.
I want to see if this one works. We'll throw the semicolon in there. Yeah, so now getting back to the test. Bonnie, I'd be curious what you think about this, but because we're using a test file, we can delete the file, and we can actually just test to make sure that calling the function creates the file and appends just the string we want. So that's a way to make sure that every time we run the test, we're starting from scratch. I don't know with Mocha, do we do that in a before?
Yeah, or before each.
Yeah. So before, is it like this? Hey man. Fun, simple, flexible JavaScript test framework.
Yeah, I think it's fun.
Let's see. So it's just takes the function to run. Okay. So before each, we're going to let's just remove the file altogether. Okay. What do we call it? Output file. Great. Great. So before each, we're going to unlink that file. And then here, we know we're starting from scratch. So we want to run the function, and then to test this, read the file and make sure that the result that we want is in there. Does that make sense to you, Bonnie?
To read the file and compare the results, yeah.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is import that function. What do we call it? Write to file x times. Okay. So let's just stick with our test we've been doing. ABC, ABC, ABC. Give this 3. And file contents equals. So now let's read the file. So that's fs read file sync and output file. And that works. With that?
It might take encoding, or it might give you like a file buffer if you don't encode it.
Okay. So
So you just put UTF-8.
great.
Standard. You could also do two-string afterwards.
Oh, two-string afterwards. But this way, this will return something in UTF-8. Great.
What would be a situation that you wouldn't want to have something as a string? Would you ever want to get like data from a file as just a buffer?
Yeah, so if you were writing some sort of low-level library that was working on an image, and I say low-level meaning like you want to work with the actual bits of the, image, then you would read this in instead of as a text file, you would read it in as a, binary buffer.
Okay.
There are few enough occasions where that's the case that, I think, especially here at the Guild, most or all of what we'll be doing is reading it in as text. But again, if you were trying to create a library that did some low-level file manipulation, that's why you would want it encoded that way. Great, so we got the file contents, and then we can do an expect file contents to equal ABC, ABC, ABC. And I might be tempted, we can come back and do this, but I'd be tempted to look at, I bet there's an after each for Mocha, and to do some cleanup afterwards where we actually get rid of the file, the test file that that we're given. And actually, the way I'm going to do this is this. So we'll do const output file equals, and let's check the environment variables. But if we don't set one, I want to make sure that we don't overwrite the default export file that's in our function. So the default there is output.txt. So let's make our default here test output.txt. Does that make sense why I'm doing that? So then we'll change this to output file, and this one to output file. Cool. So let's give it a go. npm test. fs is not defined. It will be now. All right, try it again. Type error, write to file x times is not a function. What were you saying? Yeah, I think that's right. In ES6, there's a syntax where you can write export here, and it makes it pretty nice. That way you don't have to keep track of the functions themselves and a list of the functions, but you can just specify for any given thing to export it. And I don't believe that's natively supported in Node currently. So last three characters and write to file x times. No such file or directory, unlink test output. Oh, great. So we want to unlink that, but if there's nothing there, then we want to just keep going. So did you see what the error was?
Yeah.
Yep. So let's do this.
File exists sync.
What's that?
File exists sync.
Okay.
Should it check to see if something's set?
Yeah, the other way to do it, and I'll do it this way because you seem to be comfortable with the other way. The other way to do it is to do a try and catch. So we want to try doing this and catch. I want to make sure that's the right syntax. Both Bonnie and I came from Python backgrounds, and so sometimes the shift to JavaScript is a little bit of a mind warp. Try catch. Yeah, there we go. So it's catch. And then if we get an error, we'll just console.error the error. So now let's see. Yeah, so there's no file called test output, so that function will fail again, but we're going to catch the error and just console log it and keep going. And there is the error that it wrote out. So we could choose to keep that, or we could choose to just let it fail silently because we know what's happening. So 3 passing tests. Huzzah! Well, what has you thinking that it did not run or might not have run?
I'm just wondering. Well, I guess because wait, I guess okay. Never mind. I think I was seeing something else was happening in that function. But it's all good.
Yeah, yeah. And if you ever have a concern about that, what would be your way to check to make sure that it is working?
I mean, I would see if the file was physically there in my hand. First.
That's a great way. So let's go to lecture notes. So test output, ABC, ABC, ABC. So would that satisfy the concern for you? Yep.
So for, say for instance, this function saved much bigger, I guess, volumes of data, information, whatever. Would it be any kind of regular practice that people would check to see if the function does what it does with a much smaller amount of data like this? Or would it be like you have to build like a whole model of what it looks like and then compare against that and then that route? Like, is it one or the other, or is it kind of a mixture of both?
Yeah, so is your question if you had a function like this that you were using to write a chapter of War and Peace into a file, would you test it with a smaller bit of text?
Yeah, like is that a valid thing to do, or is that going to be like you're definitely going to miss things if you try to test it like that?
Well, what I would say about that is this is when the developer asks the question, will this test account for all of the scenarios that my code might fail, or am I missing something? And so you can kind of think like writing a string to a file, you know, there's a string of 0 characters, 1 characters, 5 characters, 10 characters. It's all pretty much the same. You know, 20 characters, 1,000 characters. To my mind, if your function can write, you know, 5 characters to a file, there's no logical reason that I can think of that that it wouldn't write, you know, much larger thing. But, you know, if I were doing that, I might also just test it. I might just try running a test that does write a big string to see if, you know, you encountered some weird buffer overflow or, you know, some sort of memory thing where the function was failing out on that. So the answer is it's always a question that you want to be asking, because oftentimes you can assume if this works for, 1, 2, and 3 of something, that it'll work for 1,000 and 10,000 and whatever. But there may be edge cases where you want to check it out. Helpful? Cool. Thanks. All right.
How you doing?
Good. What does your hat mean?
I just don't know. I just picked it up from the Ross store.
From the what store?
The Ross.
Okay.
I don't really know what it means. They're kind of cool.
Hmm.
I'm gonna get myself one.
Great.
Yeah. So, yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey.
How's the lecture?
Good. Nerve-wracking. Oh, look at that keyboard. Did you get keyboard envy? Whoa, look at that.